Chapter 4 on Carbohydrates from the 15th edition of Understanding Nutrition. The brain and nervous system uses glucose as its primary energy source. Muscles store glucose, which is a simple sugar, in the form of glycogen. Glycogen and glucose provide the muscles and tissues with about half the energy they need. Sugars, starches, and fiber are all in the carbohydrate family. Grains, legumes, fruit, vegetables, and milk are carbohydrates that deliver nutrients and fiber. Although glucose is a primary fuel source for the brain, nervous system, and muscles, often carbohydrates are looked at as not so healthy. Watch the video and you'll see why carbohydrates should be included in a healthy diet and how they play a key role in our energy level and health. In Chapter 1, you learn there's 4 main elements that make up your energy nutrients, your carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. It's important to note here that carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the way you can remember that is that's the way we often abbreviate carbohydrates is by capital C, capital H, and capital O. Before looking at the answers, go ahead and match the name of the carbohydrate on the left with the category they fit within on the right. And then go ahead and check your answers. And note that mono means one, so monosaccharide meaning one sugar unit, and di meaning two, so disaccharide would be 2 sugar units. The 3 types of carbohydrates then are monosaccharides, or single sugars, which are your glucose, fructose, and galactose. Your disaccharides, which are pairs of monosaccharides, maltose, sucrose, and lactose. And then your polysaccharides, which are large molecules composed of chains of monosaccharides, which primarily glucose. And these are your starches and fiber. Monosaccharides have the same number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. They just differ a little bit in their structure, which we'll see on the next slide. They differ also in their sweetness. Glucose is also known as blood sugar, and it's an essential energy source and part of every disaccharide. Fructose is the sweetest of the sugars, and it's found is very prevalent in fruits as well as honey. Galactose is found only in a few foods, such as your dairy products. All the monosaccharides are ring structures, with fructose having 5 sides and glucose and galactose have 6 sides. They each have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And you do not need to memorize the structure, but you should know that they each have a ring structure and are made up of the same number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Remember that glucose is a part of each of the disaccharides. Maltose is 2 glucose units joined together, and maltose is produced from starch breakdown or the fermentation that yields alcohol, and then also barley. Sucrose is made of glucose again, plus a fructose, and that is what we also know as table sugar. Lactose is made from glucose and a galactose, and that's what we know as milk sugar. To link 2 monosaccharides together is called a condensation reaction, which we'll see on the next slide. Condensation, think of it releasing water. When there's condensation in the grass, for example, after a cold evening, there'll be water released onto the grass, and that's a condensation reaction. Hydrolysis, think of lysis as splitting. So hydrolysis reaction is what breaks the disaccharide into 2, and it uses a molecule of water. This shows a diagram of a condensation reaction of 2 glucose units or monosaccharides being joined together to form maltose. And with the condensation reaction, we lose a molecule of water. The second reaction is a hydrolysis reaction, breaking maltose apart, in which water is used in the reaction to break apart the disaccharide into the 2 monosaccharides, glucose. Polysaccharides are the 3rd group of carbohydrates, and poly meaning many. So many sugar units. They contain many glucose units and in some case a few monosaccharides. The first is glycogen, and glycogen is a storage form of energy in the body. It's made up of glucose units, which are highly branched. 3/4 is found in the muscle and about 1/4 in the liver. So glycogen is a storage form of glucose that's found in the muscle and the liver. Starch is the next type of polysaccharide, and it's a storage form of energy in plants. 2 types of starch are amylose and amylopectin. If you remember, we talked about amylase, the enzyme that breaks down starch. So think of amyl as meaning starch. And the difference between amylose and amylopectin is the way they're branched. So glucose units of hundreds to thousands make up starch. And again, they're either branched or unbranched. And starch is found in grains, root crops, tubers, and legumes. Glycogen on the left, and as you can see, it's made up of many glucose units, which are highly branched, and that has a physiological purpose in that you can quickly break off the glucose units for energy. And remember, glycogen is found in the liver and the muscle. The 2 types of starch, amylopectin, is more highly branched than the amylose, which is more of a coiled chain. And this can affect the rate at which they're digested and therefore absorbed. The 3rd type of polysaccharide is fiber. And fiber is found in all the plant food groups, your fruit, veggies, whole grains, and legumes. And the difference between starch and fiber is their bonds. The bonds in fiber is not digested by human enzymes. And that's where we mentioned that fiber goes through the whole GI tract undigested until it gets to the colon, and then it's partially digested or fermented by bacteria. 2 main types of fibers are soluble and insoluble, and we'll be talking about the health benefits of each and how important it is to have both types. Functional fibers are those that are not naturally present in foods, or they're naturally present but have been removed from foods and then added to other foods. For example, cellulose is naturally in different cereals, and so therefore that would be called a dietary fiber. But when it's cellulose is consumed as a supplement to alleviate constipation, then it would be considered a functional fiber. So then it's more refined, it's removed from the natural state. Soluble fiber dissolves or is soluble in water and forms gels. It's digested by bacteria in the colon and found in oats. Think of oats as a good source of fiber. We talked about oatmeal being able to make the health claim that it had soluble fiber in it and helped to lower blood cholesterol. So you can remember oats and oatmeal. Beans or legumes are also an excellent source to remember. And then some citrus fruits, and barley is a specialized form. There's associated positive health benefits, including reduces the risk for heart disease because it actually helps to lower blood cholesterol levels. And we'll talk a little bit more about the process in which soluble fiber does that in Chapter 5 on lipids. It helps to stabilize blood sugar because it slows glucose absorption. And it helps in weight management because it helps you feel full longer, as well as lowering the absorption of fat. And it helps to feed the healthy GI bacteria, again, helping to promote the health of your colon cells. Insoluble fiber does not dissolve in water, and it's pretty much left intact when eliminated. It's not digested as much in the large intestine or the colon. It's found in whole grains, so think of bran. People put wheat bran on their cereal. It's an insoluble fiber, and it helps with the digestive tract in terms of helping things move through your GI tract faster. Soluble fiber kind of slows stuff down, where insoluble fiber speeds stuff up through your GI tract. Another good source are your vegetables. So it promotes bowel movements and helps alleviate constipation. It absorbs and retains that water to increase the fecal weight and therefore speed that fecal passage through the colon. Health benefits associated with it. It helps to prevent diverticular disease, which was covered under Chapter 3. You can go ahead and take a look at that if you need to review it. Weight management, again, both types of fiber help to promote the feelings of fullness. And it helps to lower different disease risks. And that can include obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and others. So, but the two key things to remember is soluble slows things down, slows glucose absorption, helps to lower blood cholesterol. Two main things. Where insoluble fiber speeds things up through the GI tract. And that has to do more with GI health as speeding things through, alleviating constipation. And both types together can help keep people very regular in their bowel movements. This diagram is similar to the diagram you saw in Chapter 3 on overall digestion, only this one is specific to your carbohydrates. Remember, digestion of carbohydrates begins in the mouth. Starch is partially digested by amylase or salivary amylase, and it's partially digested into smaller polysaccharides as well as maltose. You remember maltose is a disaccharide made of the 2 glucose units. Also in the mouth, you've got that mechanical digestion, the chewing of your food. Then the mass, the bolus, travels down the esophagus, and the stomach acid inactivates the salivary amylase and therefore halting starch digestion. And in the stomach and the whole GI tract, fiber is not really digested. But one benefit it has is it kind of delays that gastric emptying. Remember, it makes you feel full longer, as well as it slows glucose absorption. The digestion in the small intestine and using the pancreatic enzymes or coming from the pancreatic juice, we will cover in the coming slides because there's a lot of detail there. And then the large intestine, the blue box at the bottom right corner, that illustrates that some fiber is partially digested or fermented by enzymes in the colon to produce what we call short chain fatty acids, which can help the promotion of health. It promotes the health of cells in the colon. The ultimate goal of carbohydrate digestion is to break down all carbohydrates to monosaccharides. Remember, we said monosaccharides were one of the end products of carbohydrate digestion. And all monosaccharides eventually are converted to glucose because glucose is our primary fuel, our primary source of energy. And this takes place through hydrolysis reactions. And we've covered the things that take place in the mouth and the stomach. In the small intestine is where most carbohydrate digestion takes place. Remember, the primary site of all the digestion and absorption of your energy nutrients is the small intestine. Pancreatic amylase is the enzyme that comes from the pancreas. It enters the small intestine via the pancreatic duct, and it breaks down the polysaccharides further that had come from the mouth and stomach to shorter glucose chains, as well as maltose, which is the disaccharide made up of 2 glucose units. Then there are specific disaccharide enzymes that are released from the intestinal cells to help complete the process. Maltose is broken down by maltase, remember enzymes end in ASE, to 2 glucose units. Sucrose is broken down by sucrase to form glucose and fructose. And lactose is broken down by lactase to form glucose and galactose. So then you would end up with the 3 monosaccharides or the end products of digestion. And the next process we'll be talking about is the absorption of those into the bloodstream. The large intestine, remember, we talked about that the fibers will attract water and soften the stool for passage in the colon or the large intestine. Some might be fermented by bacteria in the GI tract to form those short chain fatty acids to help promote the health of colon cells. This is a short video on digestion and absorption that you can go ahead and take a look at. Carbohydrate absorption takes place by active transport and facilitated diffusion into the bloodstream. Remember, active transport requires a carrier, and energy and facilitated diffusion requires a carrier. You do not need to memorize the details of how each monosaccharide is transported across the cell membrane into the bloodstream. Once it gets into the bloodstream, it travels via the portal vein up into the liver, where fructose and galactose will be converted to glucose. Remember, we said all monosaccharides are eventually converted to glucose in the liver. Fructose can also be converted to fat and galactose to glycogen should there be plenty of glucose available. Maybe you ate an extra big, extra large meal. Glucose can be sent back out to the body cells then for energy. This slide takes a closer look at the absorption of your monosaccharides or your end products of carbohydrate digestion. You can see the monosaccharides are color-coded. You have galactose in green, glucose in blue, fructose in purple, and then you see the folds of the small intestine, which are called villi. So the monosaccharides are absorbed into the bloodstream where they travel via the portal vein to the liver, and then they are all converted into glucose. And if you've eaten well and you have plenty of energy and glucose, then you can store glucose in the liver as glycogen, and some might travel out to the rest of the body and either be stored as muscle glycogen or used up, depending on what your needs are. Lactose intolerance is a condition in which individuals don't produce enough lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose. Lactase activity tends to be highest immediately after birth and then declines with age, with estimates of approximately a third of adults who retain enough to digest and absorb lactose efficiently throughout their life. However, this can vary greatly, and often ethnic groups have different levels of lactase activity and lactose intolerance. So it depends on a variety of factors. And if someone eliminates lactose from their diet completely and then tries to reintroduce a large amount, they often will have trouble digesting the lactose. So you'd want to reintroduce it slowly, and this can sometimes bring back some of the lactase activity. Symptoms of intolerance include bloating, abdominal discomfort, gas, diarrhea, and undigested lactose. It becomes food for GI bacteria, and bacteria kind of feed off of it when it's not broken apart. Some causes of intolerance beyond just age can be if the intestinal villi are damaged by disease. We mentioned celiac disease, in which those villi are flattened, and that can cause lactose intolerance. Some medicines, if you've got a prolonged diarrhea, which can be due to the flu, or sometimes parasites, giardia, which is what you can catch in other countries from water or in swimming pools or fast food restaurants. Sometimes individuals can catch giardia, in which there's prolonged diarrhea, and that will eventually make them lactose intolerant. Giardia can hang out in your GI tract for months or years and cause abdominal pain and intestinal discomfort. So if you have a lot of what seems like the 24-hour flu, it's something you can always get tested for. Malnutrition as well can cause lactose intolerance. And it can be there then permanent or just temporary, again, depending on the extent of damage. If someone had giardia or had celiac and they got it taken care of, then they might be able to digest lactose again. The actual complete deficiency or lack of the enzyme is actually very rare. But some people, again, have just different levels of it. And as I mentioned, there is a genetic component. If you have lactose intolerance, it's better to manage dairy intake rather than just completely restrict it. Fermented milk products actually have benefits to lactose digestion, even though they have lactose in them. You can also try hard cheeses or cottage cheese, which have much less lactose in them and are often better tolerated. Milk products such as Lactaid has the lactose already broken down inside it, or you can take enzyme tablets to break it down. Soy, rice, and almond milk are milk alternatives that you can take. Potential nutrient deficiencies, although you can get them from other sources, are potassium, magnesium, calcium, which are really high in milk, vitamin D as well. So if you purchase milk alternatives, it's always good to have them fortified with vitamin D and calcium. Individuals vary widely in the amount of lactose that they can tolerate. And this chart shows a continuum of a very low amount of lactose in foods such as breads, up to a much higher amount in your dairy products, and then the highest in milk and yogurt. So individuals really need to determine what they can tolerate and how to manage their lactose intolerance. As mentioned, all carbohydrates eventually end up as glucose and then are either used directly as energy for your cells or are stored as glycogen in the liver, which is about 1/3 of the storage, or the muscle, which makes up about 2/3 of the storage of glycogen. And your liver will supply your blood with glucose to maintain a constant level of glucose. If your glucose drops too low, you'll end up with a hypoglycemic reaction, or if it's too high, that is a hyperglycemic condition or diabetes. And so the liver maintains that constant flow of glucose to the blood, whereas muscle hoards the glucose as glycogen and uses it during exercise. And the body is only able to store enough glycogen for short periods of time. For example, your liver has enough storage for about 4 hours. That's why after breakfast, you go to classes or go to work, and right around lunchtime, your blood glucose drops, and that signals that it's time to eat again and fill up those liver glycogen stores. As mentioned, glucose is the primary energy source for the body, and so it's important to eat carbohydrate-rich foods often throughout the day. And those can be not the simple refined carbs, but the fiber-rich carbohydrate foods, your vegetables, your complex carbohydrates as your grains, your beans, your fruits have fiber in them, even though they have some simple sugars in them. And if you don't eat enough carbohydrate foods, your body still needs that glucose. And so where is it going to get it? It's going to get it from protein, either from dietary, or it'll take protein from your lean tissues, which is not an ideal thing to happen. So some amino acids can be used to make glucose. And that process of making glucose from a non-carbohydrate source, such as protein, is called gluconeogenesis. So genesis is the making of glucose. And you can also use glucose to make fat. Whenever there's excess carbohydrate, when you eat too much carbohydrate and your glycogen stores are full, the next thing that'll happen is that glucose will go to make fat. To prevent your body from breaking down too much protein for glucose when glucose isn't available, your body starts to make ketone bodies, which can also be used for fuel for the brain and nervous system. And ketone bodies are formed from fat fragments when there is an inadequate supply of carbohydrates or an inadequate supply of glucose. So ketosis, the definition, is a high concentration of ketone bodies in the blood, and it makes the blood, it can disturb the body's acid-base balance. You have mechanisms so the blood doesn't get too acidic, but it is not a healthy state to be in terms of that, as well as it tends to slow down your metabolism. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons of ketosis under weight management. Here we just want to introduce it. Carbohydrate needs are needed then to spare your body's protein. We call it protein sparing, and prevent the state of ketosis. And to do that, it's recommended to have at least 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per day. On your own, you can try to fill in the blank with the correct answer and then take a look at the answers to see how many you got correct. To help maintain a constant blood glucose level, it's important that we eat on a regular basis and we make sure we have full glycogen stores by eating adequate carbohydrate. To also help with what we call blood glucose homeostasis, or maintaining a steady state of blood glucose, are the hormones insulin. Insulin helps glucose to get into the cells, and then glucagon and epinephrine, or adrenaline, helps to break down glycogen and move glucose into the bloodstream. So the two have opposing effects that help to maintain that constant blood glucose level. If blood glucose levels fall too low, we get what's called hypoglycemia. Emia meaning blood, hypo means low, so low blood glucose. And you'll feel dizzy, you'll feel weak, you can feel nauseated, you can kind of get cold sweats. And that's why it's so important to eat regular meals. So when that blood glucose starts falling, such as between meals, the cells of the pancreas will respond by secreting glucagon, which raises blood glucose, and because it signals the liver to break down its glycogen stores and release that glucose into the blood to be used by body cells. On the flip side, when your blood glucose levels rise too high, that's called hyperglycemia. And you can also feel very fatigued and have other problematic symptoms. When your blood glucose levels rise after a meal, your pancreas secretes insulin to bring that glucose into the cells, or to lower the blood glucose. So your elevated blood glucose will return to normal levels as that excess glucose is stored as glycogen or fat. And both glucagon and insulin are secreted from the pancreas. This is a nice diagram showing what happens when blood glucose level is high after a meal, or if it's low when you haven't eaten for quite some time. So on the left, in the purple, when it's high, it signals the pancreas to release insulin into the blood. Then the insulin stimulates that uptake of glucose from the blood into the cells, or then possibly the storage of glycogen in the liver and muscles. And if that is full, then it would convert that excess glucose into fat for storage. So the end results would be a lowered blood glucose level. So insulin helps to lower your blood glucose. When you have low blood glucose, if you haven't eaten for a while, that signals the pancreas to secrete glucagon into the blood. And glucagon stimulates the breakdown of glycogen from the liver, releases glucose into the blood. So the end result of glucagon is it raises the blood glucose. So insulin from the pancreas helps to lower the blood glucose. Glucagon from the pancreas helps to raise blood glucose. Diabetes is a chronic disease in which blood sugar levels are too high. Normal fasting blood sugar is between 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter, whereas in diabetes, the fasting blood sugar would run greater than or equal to 126 milligrams per deciliter. In diabetes, insulin is either inadequate or ineffective, meaning insulin is just not working properly. It's not getting the glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. There's two major types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, which are covered on the next slide. Prediabetes mellitus is when blood sugar is somewhere between that normal fasting and the diabetic level. And individuals, if they start controlling their carbohydrate intake, they eat much healthier. Often, since weight management is a factor, if someone's overweight, they're more prone to getting type 2 diabetes. So if that individual controls their weight, starts exercising, they can keep it from going to the full diabetes. Gestational diabetes can happen during pregnancy, and women will become diabetic just during their pregnancy, and then their blood sugar would return to normal once the baby is born. Often these women are more prone, or they can be more prone to getting diabetes later in life. And when a woman is pregnant, they'll take what's called a glucose tolerance test at 28 weeks, in which that's a test to measure how your blood glucose is getting into your cells, whether or not it's getting into the cells properly. And that determines whether or not the individual has gestational diabetes. Hypoglycemia is low blood sugar, and it's actually a very rare condition. The majority of people that get hypoglycemic reactions get it from things that are often self-induced, such as if they're just not eating enough carbohydrate or enough calories in general. Maybe if they underwent really strenuous physical activity and didn't eat enough, or they didn't have enough recovery carbs and protein, their blood sugar might plummet. It can also be caused by certain medications or pancreatic tumors, overuse of insulin if the individual is diabetic. It can be caused by alcohol abuse and other illnesses, and I think I mentioned the medications. In hypoglycemic reactions, conditions are where you can get real shaky, weak, kind of cold sweats, feel real, fatigued, and it kind of takes a while to recoup if you get one of those reactions. But you can also often control it on your own through following a really good diet, having complex carbs and protein at small, frequent meals throughout the day. Type 1 diabetes is about 5 to 10% of the cases, and often it's caused by an autoimmune destruction of the pancreas beta cells. Individuals will produce little to no insulin. It often occurs in children or young adulthood versus when you get older. Whereas type 2 diabetes is the most prevalent, and there's often insulin resistance. So there might be sufficient insulin, but it's just not working properly. And often that can be caused from the individual being obese and not exercising. I mentioned gestational diabetes already, and then there's maturity onset diabetes of the young that you're not going to be tested on, and that's due to a gene mutation. This is a slide showing insulin resistance, whereas normally insulin will attach to the cell, allowing glucose to enter the cell. Whereas on the right, it shows that the receptor is not working properly. So therefore, insulin cannot help glucose get into the cell. This is a link to a video that provides more detail on type 2 diabetes, and I encourage you all to view it. To manage diabetes, it involves maintaining a certain level of carbohydrate at each meal, and we call that carbohydrate counting, where grams of carbohydrates are counted. Exercise is important, even if it's just very moderate, walking every day. Just going from completely sedentary to at least some activity can have huge improvements on blood sugar, as well as maintaining a healthful weight. With as little as 5 pounds of weight loss, it can really make a big effect on blood glucose levels in an overweight individual. Individuals with diabetes need to check blood glucose regularly, and often they go on either oral medication or insulin. You can click on the link to learn about carbohydrate counting. Glycemic response is how rapidly glucose is absorbed and then returns to a normal level. A low glycemic response is what's desired, where there's a slower absorption with a modest rise in blood glucose and then a very smooth return to normal. Whereas a high glycemic response is much less desired, and where there's a quick absorption, a surge in blood glucose, and then an overreaction of insulin that plunges glucose below normal. The glycemic index is a method of classifying foods according to their potential for raising blood glucose. The scale that the foods are measured on it's on a scale from 0 to 100, with 100 being a pure glucose solution, or they often use white bread, which responds very similar to affecting your blood glucose as a pure glucose solution. A food that has a lower glycemic index, maybe something like beans or Meat would have a very low glycemic index. It wouldn't raise your blood glucose very high very quickly. These foods can help improve glucose control. They may improve blood lipids and reduce the risk of heart disease and possibly help with weight management. The glycemic index is sometimes a useful tool, but it's not always practical. There's different factors that can influence the glycemic response, such as the amount of dietary fat in a meal or the fat in a food, the amount of fiber and protein content of the food or the meal, the rate that the food is digested, the timing or the content of meals. So there's a lot of different factors that can influence this glycemic index. But it is somewhat of a useful tool, as I'll show you in the next couple slides. A low glycemic index food is considered less than 55. Moderate, 55 to 56 to 69, and high is 70 or higher. And again, it's on a scale of 0 to 100. This is a diagram of glycemic response to foods. You can see the red line is a normal blood glucose level. The purple displays a high glycemic response, and this could happen if you drank a pure glucose solution or maybe a soda on an empty stomach, or white bread, white bagel on an empty stomach. You might have a really high blood glucose response in that first hour. Then from that you get an insulin surge, and that overproduction of insulin will then make that blood glucose level drop, and often even to below normal levels, causing a hypoglycemic reaction. A low glycemic response is in the green, where blood glucose levels rise much slower and then return to a normal level. This is a diagram showing low glycemic index foods such as peanuts on the left, which are peanuts, soybeans, cashews, foods that you would think would not cause a real big spike in blood glucose levels. And on the right, you see the white bread, but there's also some healthy foods that are on the right. And this is why just using glycemic index on its own is not always real reliable, because a baked potato, does this mean you have to avoid baked potatoes? No, it just means that a baked potato should be eaten with a meal that has a high protein source, or you could put things on the potato, whether you put some broccoli and cheese sauce or something that would lower that glycemic index. You see also foods like watermelon, and that has a pretty high glycemic index, so again, not a good thing probably to eat on an empty stomach. Ice cream actually has a lower glycemic index than you might think. It's kind of in the orange area, and that's because it has a lot of fat in it, and that lowers the glycemic index. So glycemic index isn't always telling you which are good foods or bad foods to consume. So, but it is part of the whole picture. If the more you choose the foods that are lower on the glycemic index scale, probably the healthier your meals will be. Because the glycemic index isn't always reliable just on its own and just tells what we say part of the story, it's good to take a look at glycemic load. Glycemic load will give you a more accurate picture of how a food will, in the amount that you consume it, will affect your blood sugar. For example, watermelon has a very high glycemic index of 80, but a serving of watermelon has so little carbohydrate that its glycemic load is only about 5. So you want to choose foods that not only based on the glycemic index, but based on glycemic load, which has to do with not only the glycemic index, but the amount of carbohydrate that is in a given food. You can go ahead and take a look at the links, and it will provide you more information on glycemic load. You can also take a look at this chart that compares glycemic index and glycemic load for common foods. It also gives you the net carbs of each food. And if you look to the left, the glycemic index for a low food is less than 55. And the glycemic load for a low food is 10 or less. So that's what you're looking for in choosing foods, for lower glycemic index, and even more importantly, a lower glycemic load. And how would you classify your diet? Are most of the foods you eat high or low on the glycemic index? And what about the glycemic load? You can also think about the fiber content of your meals and the balance of your meals. Do you have a good protein source at each of your meals and snacks? And you should also think about how your current diet might impact your health later on should you continue to eat the way you are. Are you on track to avoid different chronic diseases, or do you need to change your diet and lifestyle to help prevent them? A little added sugar in the diet is okay, in moderation, but too much can lead to diseases such as obesity. It can cause inflammation within the body. It's linked to hypertension as well as heart disease. We never say that sugar causes these, but there is a correlation between sugar, added sugar, and these health problems. High fructose corn syrup is often added to a lot of processed foods, and that's also linked to fatty liver disease. The other thing that can occur if someone's diet is really high in added sugars is added sugars are often in foods that have pretty much empty calories, not a lot of nutrients in many of the foods that are high in sugar. We count them as we diet plan as kind of discretionary calories, again, where we can include them in moderation. Honey is one of the sugars that has a little bit more sweetness per the amount that you typically use. Because it has more fructose in it. So sometimes you can get away with a little less sugar if you use honey versus regular table sugar. Another sugar that has a little bit of nutrients, a little bit of nutrient contribution is molasses. It has a significant amount of iron and potassium and I believe calcium. So molasses is probably one of the more nutritious added sugars there is. Although we can't say that added sugar causes diabetes or causes obesity or causes hypertension, we can say that it causes dental caries. Bacteria ferments sugars producing acid, which erodes tooth enamel. Some food factors associated with tooth decay include the time that food is in the mouth that has a lot of added sugars in it. Stickier foods tend to lead to more tooth decay because it sticks to your teeth, allowing those sugars to produce the acid, and the frequency of sugar consumption. For example, if you have a sugary beverage and you're kind of sipping on it all day, or if a mother gives their child apple juice in a bottle and the child is constantly sucking on that bottle and the apple juice is all around the teeth constantly, that can lead to early dental caries. Other factors associated with tooth decay can be how well you brush your teeth. Do you go to the dentist? Do you get fluoride treatment? There's genetic factors that are also involved. This is an illustration of a dental carie where it erodes through the enamel and it can go down into the pulp where the blood vessel and nerves are, and it can destroy the root of the tooth. You will not, however, be tested on the parts of a tooth. What do you think the dietary guidelines for Americans recommend in terms of added sugar intake? Answer is C, 10% or less of your total calories per day. Added sugars tend to provide a lot of calories with few or no nutrients. It's great that added sugars are now included on the updated food labels, and the DRI, as it mentioned, is less than 10% of your energy intake. 5% or less is even more beneficial, and there's no upper limit that's been established. Added sugar recommendations vary among different organizations. The World Health Organization recommends less than 10% of total energy, and less than 5% has added health benefits. So that's consistent with the DRI. American Heart Association makes their recommendations in kilocalories per day. So for women, 100 kilocalories per day, or about 5 teaspoons. For men, less than 150 calories per day, which is equivalent to about 8 teaspoons of sugar. 3 types of alternative sweeteners we have are artificial sweeteners, herbal products such as stevia, and then sugar alcohols. Artificial sweeteners are non-nutritive sweeteners. They don't have any nutrition to speak of, and they're very sweet at a very low dose. Some adverse effects have been found to different sweeteners, limiting their use in foods. Stevia is generally recognized as safe. It's what's on what's called the GRAS list of substances. And then sugar alcohols do provide some calories, and we'll go over their benefits and side effects in an upcoming slide. This is a chart of non-nutritive sweeteners, and there are many more that are listed here. There's a lot of money to be made in these as people want foods that taste really sweet but don't provide any calories. So saccharin, aspartame, that's also called NutraSweet, sulfamine potassium, sucralose are all artificial sweeteners. Stevia is the more natural herbal product. Their relative to sweetness to sugar is much higher. So therefore you use just a little bit or much less than you would of sugar. So even though, for example, aspartame has 4 calories per gram, because you use so little of it, because it has such a high sweetness, it has an insignificant amount of calories that it provides. There are acceptable daily intakes, or ADIs, that have been set. But the hard thing is it's hard to know if you're consuming, how many milligrams you're consuming if you drink a soda or eat cereal with it in, to know if you're ever reaching that limit. And for someone that's really little, like a child, they might reach that limit a lot sooner than an adult. So it might not be harmful to have a little bit, but all of a sudden if you're having in cereal and you have it in yogurt and then you have it in soda, it can add up to a significant amount. Most research has been done just on animals, and so therefore we don't really know long-term effects that many of these substances might have on the body. So I always caution people to use it in moderation, if at all. It does have some use for diabetics who cannot, who have major problems from real sugar. And it allows them to have some foods that are sweet without causing the rapid spike in blood sugar. Sugar alcohols, on the other hand, are different than the artificial sweeteners. They haven't been shown to cause tumors in lab animals, for example. So they're relatively, I believe, a lot safer. They are reduced calorie sweeteners, and examples you might see on a label are erythritol, glycerol, isomalt, lactitol, maltitol, mannitol, sorbitol, and xylitol are actually probably the most common. So they almost all end in OL, and so that means it's a sugar alcohol. Some of the advantages are they would make it for a lower glycemic food versus having added sugar in the food, and often much less carbohydrate would be taken in. Disadvantage is sugar alcohols kind of tend to linger in the GI tract, and bacteria can feed off of it and cause a lot of gas, bloating, diarrhea. So usually they'll put just a little bit of sugar alcohol in foods, such as in gums and candies. More recently, they've added them to energy bars. I've seen them in bagels, such as maltitol. So if you eat an energy bar and it makes you kind of sick to your stomach, or a bagel that says it's low carb, look to see if it has maltitol in it, sorbitol, xylitol, and you might want to choose a different food then if it's causing you stomach upset. And it's the foods with the sugar alcohols in it can still have a significant amount of carbohydrate and calories. There are a lot of health benefits to choosing a diet high in complex carbohydrates, meaning starch and fibers. Soluble fiber, as we've mentioned, can actually help to lower blood cholesterol and therefore lower the risk of heart disease. Diet composition, as to how that can be improved with the diet higher in complex carbohydrate, is on the next slide. Diets rich in whole grains, legumes or beans, vegetables, and fruits may also protect against lowering blood pressure and reducing inflammation in the body. Soluble fibers, and we mentioned oats or oatmeal, oat bran, barley isn't so common, but legumes or beans, that's a common source of your soluble fiber in your foods if you're eating a lot of plant sources of protein, can help to lower blood cholesterol. And the way it does this is it binds with bile acids. Bile acids are used to make cholesterol in the liver, and if soluble fiber binds with those in the body and removes them, then there's less bile acids to make cholesterol with. So your body would actually produce less cholesterol. 5 to 10 grams a day has been shown to reduce blood cholesterol by a significant amount of 3 to 5%. And a cup of oatmeal, for example, has about 4 grams of soluble fiber in it. So let's say you had a little over a cup of oatmeal, or maybe you had a cup of oatmeal and a couple oatmeal cookies or oatmeal muffin. You could use those to significantly help lower your blood cholesterol level. In relation to your overall composition of your diet, to reduce the risk of heart disease, it should be low in animal or saturated fat and lower in cholesterol, higher in both types of fiber, higher in your vegetable proteins versus your animal proteins, and that could include things like soy, nuts and seeds, beans. It could also include some of your protein powders if they're made with soy or vegetable proteins. And then your phytochemicals, some of which act as antioxidants that can help to protect against cardiovascular disease, and other phytochemicals can help protect against inflammation because they have antioxidant properties. So phytochemicals, which are found in your plant foods, can also be very beneficial. And also just in your herbs and spices too, there's a significant amount of phytochemicals. High soluble fiber foods can help slow glucose absorption and therefore help prevent or treat diabetes. High soluble and insoluble fiber foods can help to enhance the health of the large intestine. And that's by either the fiber being fermented by bacteria to promote the health of colon cells, or the high fiber, particularly insoluble fiber, helps to move food through faster through the GI tract, helping to prevent constipation, hemorrhoids, and what we call diverticula, which are little pouches that can form in the large intestine where food can get caught in there and become infected and cause inflammation and problems in the large intestine. We want to make sure we drink enough water and dilute fluids to work with that fiber to move through the system fast enough. If you don't drink enough fluids, you're going to get constipated from eating too much fiber by itself. So you want to have always increase your fiber slowly over time. You don't want to increase it too much at once. And you want to drink plenty of fluids and include both types of fiber. In terms of weight management, high fiber foods, and particularly if they're the whole grains, the complex carbohydrates, tend to be low in fat and added sugars, and they can provide less energy or calories in per gram than the higher energy dense sugary high fat foods. And the high fiber foods also promote a feeling of fullness that can help with weight management. There's an inverse association or correlation between dietary fiber and colon cancer, meaning the higher your fiber intake, the lower the risk for colon cancer. 35 grams per day reduce the risk of colon cancer in studies by about 40% compared to the intake of 15 grams of fiber per day. Many of you will find by looking at your diet and wellness reports, you might only have 10 to 15 grams of dietary fiber per day. And this is normal American diet. Typical American diet is low in fiber. Fiber supplements are sometimes recommended, but they lack the valuable nutrients and phytochemicals that your plant foods provide you with. In terms of preventing colon cancer, fiber can also dilute, bind, and remove potential cancer-causing agents, particularly that insoluble fiber that moves food through your GI tract faster. And then the bacterial formation of fiber is forming those short-chain fatty acids that can lower the pH in your large intestine, helping to promote the health of those colon cells. Excessive or too much fiber intake in American diet is not very common. But if someone was consuming way too much of the high fibrous foods, they often are lower in energy, so it might end up in insufficient energy or nutrient needs for that individual, particularly in the case of a young child or somebody that's malnourished and not eating very much, or the elderly, where those high fibrous foods promote that feeling of fullness without a lot of calories. Too much can also cause some abdominal discomfort, gas, diarrhea, particularly if you're not drinking enough fluids too. GI obstruction if you're not drinking enough fluids along with that fiber. And then too much fiber has been known to bind with some minerals because as it moves through the GI tract. So just some cautions against, and we say often if you go above 45, 50 grams of fiber a day, that some of these issues could occur. This is a great chart that you can take some time to look through. The left column shows the foods that are high in both soluble and at the bottom insoluble fiber. And then the types of fiber you don't need to memorize, but those are the actual types of fiber that are present in both soluble and insoluble foods. The next column shows the function that the fiber will have, such as a soluble fiber, oats, beans, for example, help to lower blood cholesterol and slow glucose absorption. They also help promote a healthy GI tract. So that's related to what the health risks are, or the lower risks are, of lowering the risk of heart disease, diabetes, and colon and rectal cancer. Then insoluble fiber, you can remember the whole grains, like wheat bran and whole grains, brown rice. Fruits and vegetables have both types. Legumes have both types, but they're really high in soluble fiber. And then if you look at the function of insoluble fiber near the bottom, it says increase fecal weight and speed of fecal passage through the colon. So again, it's related to colon health. And if you look at the lower risk, it's to alleviate colon type diseases, constipation, diverticulosis, hemorrhoids, and colon and rectal cancer. So looking over this chart, and you remember those few key things, that will help you on your quiz. Recommendations for carbohydrates. We've learned the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or AMDR, is 45 to 65% of our calories. The RDA for carbohydrates you do not need to memorize. That's 130 grams a day. What I would like you to remember is to have a minimum of 50 to 100 grams per day to prevent the ketosis. Fiber, and we will talk more about ketosis under weight management. Fiber is recommended about 28 grams for 2,000 calories. The number I like you guys to remember is anywhere from 25 to 40 grams a day. And that covers kind of all these recommendations on the slide. So 25 to 40 grams a day of fiber of both types is what you're shooting for. This is a great chart showing the different food groups and the approximate amount of fiber or grams of fiber per serving. Your whole grains will have 1 to 2 grams of fiber per serving, whereas if you had a bran cereal, you're going to get 10 grams or more, or if you use wheat bran on your cereal. Vegetables, approximately 2 to 3 grams of fiber per serving. Fruits, the same, 2 to 3 grams of fiber per serving, whereas beans or legumes will have 6 to 8 grams of fiber per serving. So you can see how important it is to eat these complex carbohydrates and to eat your fruits and vegetables so you can get up to that recommended amount of 25 to 40 grams of fiber per day. This slide shows the grams of carbohydrate per serving. A serving of grains, which an ounce is a slice of bread, half a cup of rice, half a cup of noodles, is approximately 15 grams of carbohydrate. Your vegetables at a half a cup is about 15 grams of carbohydrates, with the starchier vegetables having a little bit more. Your fruits, like a medium piece or a half a cup, is also 15 grams of carbohydrate. And then your milk or milk products like your yogurt would have, again, a cup would have about 15 grams of carbohydrate, whereas your protein foods have protein and fat, but no carbohydrates. Reading carbohydrate content on a food label, you want to look at total carbohydrate, which is given in grams on the nutrition facts panel. And under total carbohydrate, you'll see dietary fiber, and then sugars, which can include natural sugars, and then they separate out the added sugars. The other thing you can look at on a food label is looking at the ingredient list. Remember, the ingredients in the highest amount per weight are listed first. And that can give you an idea. If you see whole grain listed first versus a refined grain, you'd want to pick the whole grain product. You can also look at if it has the different, there's all sorts of different types of sugar you can look for in the ingredient list. This ends the recorded PowerPoint for this chapter. You're welcome to take a look at Highlight 4, which covers more information on carbs, calories, and controversies.